Well, the report is very, very carefully worded, and it says that the fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff. First, the left-hand number one engine, and secondly, the right-hand number two engine. Now, there's a lot of heat in India about Western reporting allegedly blaming the pilots, and somebody has pointed out that it's actually it's an unfortunate term to say it transitioned because it doesn't make it 100% clear whether someone actually moved the switch or whether the switch moved or whether some electronic glitch moved the engine shutoff valve. I don't entirely buy that because I think the report was carefully worded for a reason. They were trying not to point the finger at anyone in particular, which is why they didn't identify which pilot said which sentence. Since then, the Wall Street Journal has apparently published what is allegedly a leak, which is completely unacceptable. The investigation should never leak more details than there are in the preliminary or the final report. And so there's some kind of muddy water there somewhere. Now, it would be kind of logical to say that any pilot reaching for a switch would be the non-handling pilot, and that may well be what sparked this conjecture, because the handling pilot, which we know was the first officer, would have had his hands full. He would have had his hands on the controls, and the monitoring pilot would have his hands free. Now, there is absolutely no procedure or logical reason why you would shut the engines off just after takeoff. I mean, that's kind of almost so blindingly obvious that it doesn't need to be stated. So either it happened by accident, which I think a lot of people find extremely hard to believe, or it was done deliberately. And obviously, if we go down that road, then you're pointing the finger quite clearly at one of the two pilots and quite possibly the captain as a mass murderer. And, I think it's a bridge too far to say that at this stage. And the final report will reach a conclusion. A preliminary report simply tells you what they have found so far. But they're basically latched. You have to lift them up before you can move them. Now, the report muddies the waters a little further by including an airworthiness advisory notice from the Federal Aviation Administration a couple of years or so before the event, saying that some of these switches had been installed without the locking mechanism, and that they should check that. Air India have said that they didn't because it was only an advisory. On the other hand, the report also says that the console on which these switches are mounted was replaced twice, the last time in 2022. So it would be reasonable to assume that they were working as they were designed to be. In other words, you can't knock them off by accident. You've got to physically lift the switch up in order to lift it over a guard and then select one or the other position. The report is possibly deliberately, but somehow unclear. And either they don't know or they prefer not to say at this point. The investigators will know an awful lot more than we do because they will have heard the full transcript of the cockpit voice recorder. And it's worth mentioning that the cockpit voice recorder has an area microphone as well as the ones that the pilots speak into. And that will record any sound on the flight deck. So it would have been helpful if the investigators had said whether or not they were able to tell whether a switch type sound was detectable around about the time that they think the switches might have been switched off. But they don't mention that. That doesn't mean to say they don't know. I think if you were the handling pilot, you would have been focused on the instruments and looking out the windshield, possibly with a head-up display giving you all the data you need, and you'll be looking. Your primary interest as the handling pilot would be, okay, I've rotated the aircraft, we've left the runway. I want to see that we've established a good rate of climb, and then I'm going to call for the undercarriage to come up, and I'm making sure I have the right pitch attitude, and I'm looking for us to accelerate and achieve the speed schedule that I want. So he probably wouldn't be thinking about what was going on in his peripheral vision. The switches would be kind of behind his natural line of sight. There would be multiple warnings. I mean, it would, if one of the engines had actually reduced thrust and started to run down below the certain parameters, it would have triggered an engine fail warning. They would get a master caution light flashing and then warning lights telling them what had gone wrong. They would then have their attention drawn to the engine parameters. You would see whether it was still spinning at the correct speed or running down, or whether it was on fire, of course, which is one thing you would be most interested in. But you would get a very clear fire warning if that were the case. And so far as I know, there's no suggestion that that happened. In the event that you don't have a major fire, there isn't really any urgency to do anything in a hurry. You would normally expect to take stock, have the non-handling pilot look at the instruments and report back to you what was going on, what's failed, what's working. Now, they obviously hit birds with both engines, and so they probably had a multitude of indications for both engines. The fact that they chose to shut down the one that was delivering the least thrust is obviously a mistake, but I'm reluctant to be too critical about that, because they probably would have had all kinds of bells and whistles going off, and lots of indications that both engines were in trouble. Now, it takes time to analyze whether or not you should shut down one or neither or both. And as we know from the Kegworth crash back in the 1980s on exactly the same type of aircraft, if you don't do that evaluation slowly and carefully, it is possible to shut down the wrong engine. We don't know enough. Again, I mean, this is another one of those situations where only a preliminary report has been released. And also, it's been released in a very odd manner. I understand that it was released to the relatives of the victims, and in private, prior to release to the general public. And then that caused riots and chaos. So it might have been withdrawn even after that. So that's not really how I would expect a preliminary report to be released. It should be released to the public in its original untouched form. Well, yes, indeed. And, one of the reasons that I wrote my book was because the single most important thing that decides your safety is the culture in the airline. If it is a disciplined, professional safety culture with a good training regime, then that makes a huge difference. I don't know anything about Jeju Air's training regime. I've not seen or read anything to indicate that it was not as it should be. But there is one whole chapter in my book about Korean air crash by Korean Airlines, in which culture really did play a major, if not the major cause. So I don't know. The accident at Kegworth, in which they shut the wrong engine down, was definitely down to a cultural problem in the training department. And I did used to work for that actual airline, so I heard quite a lot about that. And that may have been a factor with Jeju Air, but on the other hand, it may not have been. They may have been very well trained. But basically, pilots are trained in the simulator to do sorts of all manner of emergency procedures. We used to spend 2 days in a simulator every 6 months dealing with emergencies and problems, and anything that like this that might have happened would then be put into the training regime to make sure if there was a mistake made that you didn't make the same one. Um, at this point, again, I'm afraid we're back in the same territory of too early to judge. Yeah, I mean, I can see why the investigators might welcome, I mean, they would want every kind of information they can get. And obviously, if there was a video evidence of what went on in the cockpit, they would know the answers pretty clearly by now. It may well be that they do know the answers clearly. I mean, you get quite a lot of information from a sound recording. Um, it's something that I think pilots would resist for the simple reason that they're already scrutinized, trained, checked, examined, monitored, regulated to the yin yang. And, it's always possible for unscrupulous management to start picking holes if they can start watching what's going on the flight deck. If there's somebody they want to demote or get rid of, they can get into trouble for putting their coffee in the wrong sort of holder or something. It's a very difficult area. I'm not entirely convinced that it will improve safety. Of course, we should be doing everything we can to minimize crashes. I think in any responsible environment with a good airline and a regulatory environment, that is already happening. I actually tell in the book exactly how you can tell which airlines are the ones to avoid, and I'm not going to say it in public because I don't want to be sued. Um, but you can look at the statistics, and just as a broad brush, the Japanese very seldom have an accident. Most European and American airlines don't either. But that's not to point the finger at nationalities so much as the culture in the individual airline. That's really what it comes down to. If the training is good, corner cutting and sloppy behavior is completely unacceptable. Discipline is maintained and the correct procedures followed all the time. It is an extremely safe way to travel.